Praise be to God, the Lord of all. Praise Him, all creatures, great and small. With raptures now the
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear brothers and sisters, my name is Mumin Khan. I'm the Chief Executive of Britain's first mosque and the National Heritage Center. It is my great honor and a privilege to welcome you here at this historic mosque. It is really befitting to have the second book launch of Abdullah Quilliam here at the birthplace of Islam in Britain, at the Abdullah Quilliam Mosque.
So it's a great pleasure to introduce Sidi Yahya to tell us more about the book. And actually, Brother Jamil has just reminded me that Brother Yahya, when we first got to know Brother Yahya, it was as a publisher. So he used to run Cube Publishing at the Markfield Institute. Since then, he's obviously contributed enormously to the area of Muslims in Britain. And I'd say he's one of the foremost Christian scholars, along with Ron Jeeves. So we're delighted that he's undertaken this project, and without further ado, I'd like to invite Sidi Yahya to say a few words about it.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for braving the English rain and Omicron. I really appreciate that. And thank you to the Abdullah Quilliam Society, to Mockman, to Farhad, to the stewards, everybody here. Thank you to Jamil and his team at Beacon Books for having done a splendid job with the book. I agree with him, there's much more to publishing than printing. It takes a lot of editorial work to bring a book right up to scratch. And a lot of people, unfortunately, find out the hard way when they self-publish on Amazon, but it's not as easy as it looks. Anyway, enough about publishing. What I have to do in the next 25 minutes, 30 minutes is to give you a sort of an insight into Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, the first man in Britain really to preach Islam in a concerted way, and the builder of the first mosque community in this country. So he's a founder figure of Islam in this country. And he was a man of many parts, a man of great energy and resolve, talent. I believe that if he were alive today, he would have stood out even in our community today, which is more than 3 million strong, because he was a very talented and capable individual. But be it as it may, he was there at the beginning. There were fewer than 10,000 Muslims in Britain at the time, mostly working class Muslims who'd come either as personal servants or had come as sailors. There were a few rich families who sent their children, mostly sons, to study law and the like at Oxford and Cambridge and London, or medicine. But Abdullah Quilliam was really on his own when he started preaching Islam in 1887 in Liverpool, and he by and large did it on his own. And so the core of his community were converts to Islam, some hundreds, and it was by and large it was a working class community. People had jobs like being plumbers or tradesmen or clerks. The city at the time, the second great port of empire, had many clerks. So it was a working class community, and they had all come from mostly devout Christian backgrounds of various denominations, although some Catholic, some Protestant. Quilliam himself came from a Wesleyan background, which is a branch of Methodism, which is a form of Protestantism, and he had been brought up as a devout Christian. And so he was self-taught, really, He taught himself about Islam. He first encountered it on a trip in Morocco in 1883, and he stayed for maybe about 6 weeks. Met Muslims there and said, although they asked him to recite the Shahada, the declaration of faith, he said, look, I've got to go home, I've got to study for myself. And so he did that. He went back. He didn't just read about Islam, he read about all of the different religions. It was a collection by Max Muller, who reported a series called Sacred Texts, of which the Quran is one, by E.H. Palmer is one of the ones in that series. And he confirmed his faith in Islam privately in 1886. But as I said earlier, what was extraordinary was his resolve to preach Islam to his own people, to be a witness to the truth of Islam. And that is what marks him out really as an historical figure of importance in our country and to our community. But among many other things, he was a man of many parts. One of the things he gave time to throughout his life was poetry. So as well as being trained as a lawyer and as a journalist, he was double trained in both. He liked poetry, and he published a newspaper, the first Islamic weekly published in English in our country, published from 1893 to 1893 to 1908. And every week in that publication, The Crescent, there would be a poem that would be published somewhere. They would pick maybe a poem often by one of the romantic poets at the time, one of the 19th century poets like Browning. But increasingly, converts to Islam began contributing poems to the Crescent. So there are hundreds of poems in these newspapers. But Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam himself was a prolific contributor. Ron Jeeves and I, I'm sorry Ron isn't well and unable to be with us today, but Ron Jeeves and I ended up doubling the amount of poems that we thought existed. We thought there were about 90 poems, but we ended up with 190 poems in the end, 189 to be precise. We left a few out for various editorial considerations, but the poems span about 40 years of his life. He may have written some poems as a young man, but we don't think they've survived. But we searched high and low from the journals of India, British India, to his own publications, to obscure newspapers in the Isle of Man and in the Scottish lowlands. So he published poems in all of these places. So what I'm going to do is to read a selection of them for you tonight, 4 or 5 poems, so you get a kind of flavour of him as a poet. So the first poem I'm going to read, which you may have heard as we came in, Brother Farhad mentioned it just now, the first surah paraphrased. So this is a poetic rendering of the meanings of the first opening chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, that we recite every day in our daily prayer. And this is the important thing why I mentioned that Quilliam was self-taught. He taught himself Islam in his early years from essentially 19th century British Orientalist sources. He was influenced by his Methodist upbringing, so he wanted a way to call people to Islam in a way that was culturally familiar to them. So basically he set up, in its early years the mosque was known until at least 1894, as far as I can tell from tiny sources, as the Church of Islam. They held a Sunday divine service at 7 p.m. every Sunday. And in that service, they would sing hymns accompanied by an organ. And so we have 7 of those hymns in this collection. They're the first 7 poems. And these were often popular tunes of the day, but Quilliam would change the words to make them more Islamic. But 7 of those hymns were his own compositions, original compositions, and they're the ones that we've put into this book. So the idea was that he would introduce Christians to Islamic content in a cultural form that they were deeply familiar with, which was the Sunday service. And so Islamic messages would come through the words of the hymns that he had changed, or his own compositions. So this is the first one that of the three, which is his own poetic rendering of the meanings of Surah Al-Fatiha. Praise be to God, the Lord of all. Praise Him, O creatures, great and small. With raptures now the mercies sing, of Him the day of judgment's King. Exclaim, O Lord, we worship Thee. Now while we kneel on bended knee, O grant us by Thy mighty power needful assistance every hour. Direct us, Lord, in the right way, nor ever let us go astray. Graciously keep us in Thy path, preserve us from Thy holy wrath. And when the sands of life have run, and all our time on earth be done, we pray Thee, O Thou God of love, take us to Thee in heaven above. I couldn't quite pluck up the courage to sing that to you. We're working with Reverend Ian Stubbs and Reverend Helen Stubbs, looking at historic hymns of the time of the late 19th century, and we hope in future to be able to perform some of these original hymns to their original tunes. But we weren't quite able to get it together for this event. So please forgive me for that. But that first one was written in a form called long meter, and it was meant to be sung. So Quilliam, he was the imam of his community, his small community, and many of his poems, you can see in them that they are teaching poems. And this is a long tradition within Islamic history, that many of our religious scholars use poetry as a form of education. They use poetry to teach people about morals, manners, about grammar, about fiqh, about jurisprudence. It was a way to access the curriculum, the Islamic studies curriculum. So Sheikh Abdullah here, this is one of the first from 1895. This is a teaching poem. I think that he's written for the benefit of his readers and the newspaper and for his congregation. So like many of his poems is a kind of reflection upon a verse of the Quran. In this instance, chapter 16, verse 1 to 5, from Surah Al-Nahl, from the B. And the translation that Quilliam used to quote was by George Sale, which was an early translation from 1734. So invite men unto the way of thy Lord by wisdom and mild exhortation, and dispute with them in the most condescending manner, for thy Lord well knoweth him who strayeth from his path, and he well knoweth those who are rightly directed. Now I should say that condescending in early 19th century, 18th century English doesn't have the meaning that it has today. So today, to condescend means to look down on someone, see them as a social inferior. But in its older sense, to condescend means to give up your rights or your claims, to consent, to agree, or to acquiesce. So just to be clear, that it's not a mistranslation, but it's a change of meaning in the word. So here is Quilliam's poem. Be not hasty in opinion, slowly judge your fellow men. Haste may hide the good dominion, acts of folly have outran. What if he has erred often? Should we not remember still? Gentle admonition soften, and attract the stubborn will. Language harsh and wanting feeling, bow the spirit for a time, rankles where the wound was healing, and perhaps excites to crime. Are you free from human errors? Are your faults so few to scan, that you wield the sword of terrors, your weaker fellow man? Lift the veil from that proud spirit, ask if you remember aught, where loud censure you did merit, had you then been fairly caught? Every man should guard his station, and his feelings fairly scan, and remember that temptation comes to all his fellow man. So, as you may know, Sheikh Abdullah, the news of the fact that there was a community of converts, a mosque had been established in Liverpool in 1889, was sensational news across the Muslim world. There were daily reports or weekly reports of the activities of this small community of converts in the Turkish press, in Egypt, in India. This was sensational news, and so what it meant was that Abdullah Quilliam, Sheikh Abdullah, began to get an international profile. One of the things that put him on the map was the fact that he was part of a campaign against a satirical play about the life of the Prophet, which was called Muhammad, and which was by a playwright called Hawkane. And by the actions of the small British Muslim community, and in concert with the Caliph, Abdul Hamid II, the play was withdrawn from the English stage that year. So Sheikh Abdullah's role in that campaign that brought him to the notice of the notice of the Sublime Court and the Caliph, Abdul Hamid II. Much of his poetry does in fact refer to the Ottoman dynasty, to its history and so on. Equally, so he became associated, if you like, with a kind of what we call Islamic unity or Islamic solidarity, what was known at the time as Pan-Islamism, that was what it was called. So he was known as a strong advocate of Pan-Islamism, okay, of Muslim unity united under the banner of the Caliph. The sort of thing that would get him in trouble with the Daily Mail today, no doubt. But he had a doctrine of dual loyalty. He said repeatedly that he was loyal to Crown and to Caliph, both, to Queen Victoria and to Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And he would mention Abdul Hamid in his khutbah, and he would also ask Allah to give Victoria wisdom in ruling over her subjects, to endow her with wisdom, with hikmah. So probably his cheekiest poem, I think, kind of touches on the way in which his sense of humour, the way that he would play around with tensions about loyalty. And we're very familiar with this, that the questions about British Muslims today is, do we have dual loyalties and so on. And in fact, this was a live question during the colonial period. And here, Sheikh Abdullah has rewritten the words to the British national anthem, God Save the Queen, or God Save the King, as it was in his late, when this was written. I think Victoria had passed away. And he's rewritten it as a Muslim anthem. So you can imagine the tune. I'm not going to inflict my voice on you, but it goes like this. God bless the Muslim cause, bless all who keep thy laws and do the right. Uphold the Muslim band in this and every land, give them full strength to stand firm in the fight. Strengthen and help the weak, and teach us all to speak thy truth abound. May love and liberty, truth and sweet purity, with plenteous charity in us be found. Hear thou the orphan's cry, assuage the widow's sigh, the foolish chide, let vice no more abound, but happiness be found in every home and round the world so wide. So I think that's very pointed by Sheikh Abdullah to rewrite the words to the national anthem. This was a community that was often, particularly, I don't want to over-exaggerate it, but really in the first 5 or 6 years that it had in this mosque here in Brown Terrace, they had a difficult time of it because it was a very busy thoroughfare of the city, many people coming up and down the road. And they would call the adhan out aloud from the first floor window. And the poor mu'azzin, who would call out the adhan in Arabic and English, he would get pelted with stones. On one occasion, it was Hassan Arthur Radford. He was injured, and that was reported not only in the Liverpool press, but actually reported in the Turkish press and further abroad as well. So they had, on a few occasions, the mosque was forcibly entered, and the prayers were broken up by people coming in. Somebody placed tripwires, and there was quite a lot of tension and pressure. But Sheikh Abdullah, through his sort of wise and sagacious leadership over time, building connections through and their sense of public service for other people in the city, eventually was able to build support for the community. So in 1898, Liverpool's mayor came to celebrate Eid at the mosque. And this is the historic first visit by a British city official to any mosque in our history. That was John Holding. John Holding was very famous in Liverpool because he also happened to be the founder of Liverpool Football Club. And Sheikh Abdullah knew him very well because as a lawyer, John Holding asked him to represent the Carters Union. The Carters Union was one of the largest unions in Liverpool at the time. The Carters were the ones who took the goods from the ships and put them into the warehouses. And Sheikh Abdullah was first of all their solicitor, and then he was elected the second president of the union after John Holding retired to become Lord Mayor of the city. So as you can see that he was relying on his public service and his personal friendship to bring protection to the mosque and to his community. But as an imam of his community, there are many poems in his collection where he asks his brothers and sisters in faith to have courage, have fortitude, and despite the pressures upon them, don't give up. Keep on struggling, keep on fighting. This is one of those poems where he's exhorting his congregation to carry on. Okay? Keep calm and carry on. So its title in Latin is Nil Desperandum, Never Despair in English. Courage, brother, do not falter. Dry your tears and cease from sighing. Though clouds look black, and they soon may alter, and the sun will send them flying. Out of evil oft cometh good, is a maxim to my liking. The blacksmith well the iron beateth, but 'tis better for his striking. Work today and give up grieving. Know that joy is born of sorrow, and though today is rainy weather, perhaps will brighter be tomorrow. Gambling doth not make our labour the least bit more a pleasant task. 'Tis joyful heart that lightens trouble, contentment brings to those who ask. First the childhood, then the manhood, first the task, and then the story. 'Tis after nightfall comes the dawning, first the shade, and then the glory. Mashallah. So, I'm trying to give you a flavour here of his poems, and they're very, I'm focusing a little bit more on the religious poetry, and so far he does have nature poetry. He's got some romantic poetry in here, he's got some historical poetry too, but I'm going to finish off with some of his later poems. So he leaves Liverpool in 1908, and he settles eventually, after a number of years, settles in London, where he comes under a new identity, Henri Mustapha Lyon, or Henri and Lyon, and he gives up his former life. And maybe I can, answer questions as to why he did that in the Q&A. Let's focus for the moment on his poetry. So, yeah, that's fine. And so he he wrote, one of our discoveries for this collection was that he published a book of poetry under another identity, which we discovered was him. So, Sheikh Harun Abdullah. So he had presented Sheikh Harun Abdullah as a Nevlevi Sufi sheikh of the 16th century. But after detailed research, we found that actually it was just another pen name, or takhallus, pen name for him as a poet. And in these poems, because he's no longer overtly living, overtly identifying publicly as Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, this is where he can sort of talk about his mystical feelings, his religious feelings, his emotions in a very intimate way. And I think some of his most beautiful poetry comes in his later years, and that's why it's so important that we've uncovered these poems. I also think that, so the first poem I'm going to read from this period, his later period, is quite, I think, autobiographical. It's about his struggle, about him having to give up his former life. And he's chiding himself for having pursued fame and fortune. So I think when he talks about the poet in this poem, I think he's really talking about himself. This is my interpretation. Maybe you would have another interpretation, but this is my interpretation. The song that lived. A poet once upon a time did venture to essay a rhyme, and to himself did a musing say, I'll sing a song to live for I. Then one he wrote to please the crowd. They chorused it in accents loud. It rained a month, and then one day the crowd took on another leg. No more I'll write, vile mob, to you, he said, and wrote to please the few. His song was sung before a king, and then became forgotten thing. Begone, he said, all thought of self, all thirst for fame, I'll please myself. I'll pen a strain, for such a part, I'll write the thoughts within my heart. His inmost thoughts, then he did pen, not caring he for king or men. He sang of joy, he spoke of tears, and lo, his song outlived the years. The only song that ne'er knows death, the one that e'er holds vital breath, the lines that want no skill or art, are those which gush forth from the heart. So we're going to end with a humorous poem and a poem in praise of the Prophet. So we all know that Abu Huraira, who we learnt in Madrasa, Abu Huraira means what? Father of kittens. So here's Sheikh Abdullah on the mighty narrator of Abu Huraira. This is called Respect the Cat. Hast heard the story, how one summer's day, within a mosque, a cat once happed to stray. Just at the time God's prophet had gone there to make, as was his wont, the Dhuhr prayer. With measured tread it stepped with noiseless feet, and before God's prophet calmly took its seat, and purring gently sat there calm and still, afraid of naught, suspicious of no ill. And lo, by Allah's will, ere wise and good, the cat was seized with pains of motherhood, and twixt its pains, common to all of earth, there in the mosque to kittens 3 gave birth. Remove the brute, then loudly one did cry, to thus pollute the mosque, sure it should die. Say not such words, God's prophet then did say, remove it not, in peace let it here stay. Do not a thing, its feelings now to jar, respect the cat, this cat hath only done that which it should, and hath performed its work of motherhood. What Allah hath decreed for all the race, as nature's law, sure can be no disgrace. And Muslims learn this, the lesson that Allah doth teach to all, respect the cat. Thy father honour, and thy brother love, protect thy sister, but of all above, respect thy mother. She it was who bare thee in her womb and lavished on thee care. Known but to Allah, Muslims think of that. This cat the mother is, respect the cat. And finally, one of my personal favourites is a ghazal in praise of the Prophet. So long as the heart doth pulsate and beat, so long as the sun bestows light and heat, so long as the blood through our veins doth flow, so long as the mind in knowledge doth grow, so long as the tongue retains power of speech, so long as wise men true wisdom do teach, the praise of God's prophet, Ahmed the Blessed, shall flow from our lips and spring from our breast, plus Rasulullah from darkness of night, did lead us to truth, did give to us light, did point out the path which followed with zest, leadeth to Islam, and gives peace and rest. Praise be to Allah, 'twas He who did send Ahmed Muhammad, our Prophet, our friend. So, I commend this book to you. I think it will surprise you, it will delight you, it may sometimes perplex you. I think that it's important for us to realise that we have English. The English is becoming an Islamic language, by which I mean that as Islam spread to every part of the world, it enriched and ennobled and beautified the literatures of the world, and English is no exception. And so I think that we should now be thinking seriously about English as an Islamic language, with its own Islamic literature, its own canon of Islamic literature, its own poetry, its own great works, and so on. And this is increasingly the case. Increasingly, we think about Martin Lings' Life of the Prophet. This was translated into very many languages, Arabic and Urdu and Turkish and so on. The same is true of Sheikh Abdullah's first book, The Faith of Islam. I've found copies in Turkish, Urdu, Arabic, Farsi and Bosniak, and also extracts in French, but there are others. It was translated in dozens of languages, but I haven't been able to find the printed, sort of outputs of that, so that's the ongoing research. So we can understand that certain works are written in English about Islam, or certain poems are written that have their own majesty and their own worth. So I think it's important for us as we begin to embody English as our mother tongue, that we in the most eloquent way can express our deepest emotions, our highest values, our most heartfelt beliefs in English, and beautify and present the Deen of Islam in the best way in this language. So I like to think that Sheikh Abdullah's poems is a brick, is like a foundation stone in that endeavour. And my own personal plan, inshallah, that I will also be working with other scholars to bring out other early poets who wrote in English, in order to broaden our literary canon. And again, I'd like to commend the Beacon Books for taking this step into understanding that building our literary heritage is very, very important. It's part of our building our Islamic culture in Britain. And for any Muslim who speaks English, to be honest, English is a global language, and so these poems are for anybody who enjoys English poetry. So I commend this book to you, and ask you to make du'as for its acceptance, inshallah, and thank you, Jazakallah khair, and thank you for having me here.
SubhanAllah, that was something really tremendous. We just heard there, I'm sure you'll all agree. I hope those watching online as well appreciated that. This slot is now given over to question and answers. I think just because to ease the transition, we maybe take 3 questions and then I'll ask Sidi Yahya to come up and address those. So I don't know if there's any questions from the floor at this stage, and I can jot them down and we can pick them up. Yes?
I had two, but one was following on from Yahya's. You mentioned he changed his identity or the name he presented himself when he was born. You said that might be a question people can ask in the Q&A. So that's something I wondered about. And then I also wondered what brought him or took him to Morocco in the first instance. Not, yeah, that very first. Why did he end up there?
So why did he adopt the Henry de Leon name?
Yeah, yes, I mentioned
You took a third.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions at this point? Yes, please, sir.
Do you know if the Faith of Islam, his first book, is it in print available at the moment? And the second question I have is, was he fluent in Arabic and Farsi? Or that's okay.
So, doesn't mind. No, I think so. Okay, so the main reason given, there were two reasons given. Well, there's one contextual reason and there's one reason that was given for the name change. Okay, so the contextual reason was that he was barred as a solicitor in 1909 for falsifying evidence in a divorce case. Now, this was not an uncommon practice amongst English lawyers of the day because marriage law, divorce law was very strict back then. You needed to have a kind of something like proven adultery, or and that was very difficult to prove. So what this meant was that a lot of women were stuck in abusive, violent marriages that they couldn't really escape from. So what often lawyers would do would set up the husband with the lady of the night in order to get the woman out of the divorce and then have them be discovered. So this was a common practice. So this is essentially when he was barred as a lawyer. This is when he had, he left Liverpool for good. As for the name change was his daughter said it was because of him benefiting from a will of another family, and I believe that this would have been to his second wife, Mary Leon. So I think Leon, L-E-O-N, is a play on lion, L-Y-O-N. So I believe that it was maybe to benefit his children from his second marriage after his first wife had died in 1909. This is what I think may be. This is what was said at the time. So there are more theories and there are more, like academics will argue about why he left and why he changed his name. But I don't. Today is not the day to delve into all of that. I thought I'd just give you a couple of things from the historical evidence that we know. What was your second question?
What took him to Morocco in
Okay.
first instance? That was his first interaction with.
Okay, so he was a workaholic. I mean, he worked far too hard. He had a double career as a journalist and as a lawyer, and he became exhausted in his 30s. His doctor ordered him to take a holiday because you have to rest. He was madly passionate about geology. He'd won like a national prize in geology, came first in the country in the national exam as a young man. And so he went to Gibraltar to study the rocks. When he got there, he thought, Morocco's just across the way, let me go and have a look. And that's when he first encountered Muslims and talked to them about it. He was very interested in religions anyway. He was curious. And that seems to really, he went for geology, but he picked up something far more valuable than a rock. That's the reason. I don't believe he was self-taught. He was an able linguist. He self-taught himself over many years, taught himself at least reading knowledge of Arabic and Farsi and Turkish. How good he was in speaking those languages, I'm not so sure, because some of the reports seem to indicate he needed translators to help him when he was taking him around Istanbul. Certainly in his early trips to Istanbul. So I think like with anything, he picked up, when he gave his address in 1928 as an old man, he went to Cairo and gave one of his last public lectures on Islam. He spoke in English, he didn't address them in Arabic. So I'm not sure he had spoken confidence in those languages, but certainly he had some reading familiarity. That much is clear. And what was your second question? Sorry.
The first book is published.
Okay, so I mean, like the first book is digitally being published. As you saw, digitally, we probably know that we published the original in like a digital print-on-demand form. So it's available in that format. But what it really needs is a kind of a critical edition, talking about the history of the text and how influential it was and all of that. It needs like proper presentation. So it should be republished in a new edition, but with a proper introduction. It does need to be done for that work. It's maybe another one of the works, Fanatics and Fanaticism, which is the first really dour pamphlet in English, if you like, that was ever delivered, on Islam in these hours in English. So I think that also is very historic. So those two pamphlets are certainly, really, really important. I mean, both of them went through a number of editions.
Just touching on some of your closing remarks on the very enjoyable speech, where you're saying the use of the indigenous language for the expression of Islam. My understanding is after Sheikh Quilliam passed away, his followers sort of dispersed. I may be wrong in that, but I'd be interested to, I guess the question I'm asking on the back of that observation, if the observation is correct, is as Muslims who are now here over 100 years after the first copying of Quilliam, as it were, what lessons are there for us in how his legacy fared in the aftermath of leaving Liverpool and him passing? Because I'm sure there's some lessons are pertinent, especially with your comments about the indigenization of Islam culturally in the English context. And secondly, if I may, a slightly cheeky question, because my brother's here who's a crazy mad Liverpool fan, and you talked about the connection with Liverpool Football Club. Can you confirm the speculation that Sheikh Quilliam had a season ticket to
well, on your second remark, I can neither confirm nor deny. The historical record is silent on his membership of the Liverpool Football Club. But certainly he knew John Holding. They weren't just acquaintances, they were friends, old friends. He'd known him from when he was a young man. I think he saw John Holding as a bit of a mentor as well, because he's the older man, and he was a well-to-do businessman and philanthropist in the city. I mean, King John, as he was known, used to give dinners to the poor. I think he influenced Quilliam's practice of giving dinners to the poor on Christmas Day. The other thing I should mention, we are here now. This is the West Derby Union. This institution, under the Poor Law Act of 1834, built the old Yahya Hospital in Liverpool and many poor houses. And the thing is that John Holding was the chairman of this institution while Quilliam was next door at the mosque. So I like to think that it was nice that, despite all the problems that Quilliam's congregation had in the early years, I like to think he had some solace by having a friend next door in John Holding, who he worked very closely with. So we should remember John Holding as well. Remember that he made the point of coming to visit the mosque and supporting the mosque. So we should remember that. It's really important. And with Mo Salah and all the other Muslim players of the football club, more could be done, I think, to connect Liverpool Football Club to this mosque, so they understand the historic connection that they have with England's first mosque. I think that would be a good thing to do. And so, what was your first? So I haven't had any questions from any of the sisters.
There's one sister.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very useful speech, mashallah, thank you. I'm just wondering, when you're speaking about the very first mosque, it's not actually in this building, it's in the white building.
Yeah.
Is it true that the gentleman who was it the very first postal for boys as well. I didn't think you mentioned that, and it was he raised the children as Muslim.
You had an orphanage, yeah.
An
Rather than a
orphanage
boys'
for
store,
boys.
yeah, it was an orphanage, yeah.
Yeah, and it was basically on the agreement to take them in and look after the boys if
That's right,
we could raise them as Muslim boys.
Because often the kids would be abandoned on the
Yes,
doorstep.
abandoned children, yeah.
Illegitimate children would be abandoned, yeah.
Mashallah.
So,
I think there were girls as well.
boys and
Not
girls,
Not
yeah.
just
Boys and girls, yeah.
Mashallah.
And originally it was in Shields Road before it moved to number 12. So this surviving is 8, 9 and 10. There used to be 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. 11 and 12 have been knocked down.
I was originally from Shield Road.
Oh right, okay, well that was where the orphanage was, number 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a small world.
And was there a particular reason why he wanted to become unknown? Because he wanted to go, he went to London, didn't he? And he didn't want to be known as the...
I think it's a long debate, and maybe we can talk about it another time, but, academics debate line, and the thing is that historical record doesn't often give you the inner motivations of people. You just have kind of general pieces of information, and we don't have his diaries, we don't have his personal papers, we just have a few things left that were things that he published. So we don't have that very sort of inside look at his life, actually. And that's just the fact. Some of the questions that people want answers to, the historical record doesn't really allow us to answer. I think it's the kind of thing that people could explore in a novel or work of fiction. They can maybe come up with a theory as to why somebody wanted to, change their identity.
Yeah.
But he never, let me be clear that he was known amongst the British Muslim community. They protected his changed identity. So they knew he was Abdullah Quilliam. Okay. He worked with them. They still gave him positions of prominence in London. And he did some important, he had a secondary role in London. He's no longer a leader, but he took up positions, he provided leadership of some kind and mentorship. He even ran a Juma Friday service from his home in Bloomsbury for some time, and led the prayers in London as well from his home. So the thing is that I'm not saying he disappeared off the map. I'm just saying that they respected his decision, and the Muslims and his old non-Muslim friends, they respected his decision and didn't reveal who he was. And to be honest, the identity was quite shaky, because a few times he was recognised in very public circumstances. And so it didn't always work out anyway, to be honest with you.
I thought that might be in the reason.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Did you have any children in that?
So it was a gentleman behind you.
So in Farsi language, there is a lot of poets, writers from Delhi, Iran, Afghanistan, in the region called Khurasan or Aryan region. So most of them, they base their work on Islamic teaching, and famous of all, Rumi.
Yeah.
Sajjamuddin Afghan, we call it. So I'm sure if you have heard his name Rumi, he also based most of his work in poems specifically, and also it's very famous and translated in English. So what interests me that how do you compare Rumi's work to Abdullah Quilliam?
Rumi is like the ocean and Quilliam is like the drop. We can't say that he's a great poet, but he's a decent poet. I think that John Parkinson is, he was another convert. I'm working on his poetry collection of him now. I think he's the better poet. But Sheikh Abdullah is a historic figure who founded the first mosque in this country. So just for that alone, his poetry has historic value anyway. And I think some of it is rather fine. There are about 10 or 15 poems in here which I think are quite fine moving poems, and the rest are all of interest, definitely. So there's a lot of variety here, and I think you won't get bored because there's not one kind of poem in here. There's a big variety in this collection. Okay.
If the masjid next door was Britain's first mosque, is it accurate to say that Sheikh Abdullah was Britain's first formally appointed imam? as a prayer leader. We had the kind of boarding houses for the last course prior to that, but that was more of a makeshift arrangement. So is it accurate to call it a meeting space?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because he didn't always act in the role of imam. I mean, he did read the khutbah, but not always, and he didn't always lead the prayers. So he wasn't like, he was more like he was more like the founder of the mosque, and more like, he was their leader, their religious leader, but not their imam per se, only as their imam as we understand it today. So I'm not sure we could really say that. Sorry, that's not very helpful, but I don't think that was
in the kind of the 1908 reincarnation, so to say. He relocated down to Walkingham. Interestingly, if I'm not mistaken, Walkingham, the mosque next door, opened in the same year, several months apart. So, is it accurate to say that in the post-1908 phase of his life, Walkingham became the epicenter of British Islam, but his religious authority was democratized. So there was other figures there like Mumji people, Lord Headley of Value, and so there was more of a community there with other religious leaders, whereas in the pre-1908 period, he was the sole figurehead. Would you say that's an accurate?
Well, no, I wouldn't say so, because there was quite an active Islamic association in London, which, although they didn't have their own mosque, there was a temporary mosque in London from 1895, on the Euston Road, and run by actually a kind of a student of Quilliam's, Haji Muhammad Ali, who's originally from Cape Town, whose son had come up to study at the school here in the mosque. No, I mean, I think that not everybody accepted Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam's authority as Sheikh of Islam amongst the British Muslim community, such as they were. Not everybody accepted it. And he did have his critics in London and elsewhere. And then he had his supporters. He had the mosque had a lot of support from the Muslim community in Manchester. So the Syrian cotton traders and the Morocco, particularly because they were all Ottoman citizens at that time. So the Ottoman connection was very important. So they used to mark Sultan Abdullah II's birthday every year. They marked his birthday in the mosque. So the Ottoman consul would come to that event, and they would bring over from Manchester, and they'd bring the Ottoman citizens would come up. Some of them wouldn't even be Muslim, be any Ottoman citizen would come for that celebration of the Sultan's birthday. So the Ottoman, like with anything, nobody can have uncontested authority, I don't think, in our community. So it's just not how it works, does it? It doesn't really work that way. I think that the other interesting thing is that the title Sheikh of Islam itself, it was not an official designation from the Caliph. It was a title that was adopted by Quilliam by election of the members of the mosque, of the institute. They took a vote and they ran a resolution, they took a vote, they elected him as their Sheikh of Islam of the British Isles. And that's the first time I saw that title being used. But it's not been used in any official Ottoman correspondence. So, though the Ottomans never, they knew he was using the title. They didn't sort of go out and sort of, disclaim it or anything like that. He was still seen as, he still represented the Caliph officially in two missions. One in 1894 to Lagos, the mosque, and then in 1908 to visit, it was quite a sensitive mission to report on unrest in the province of Romania, which is in modern-day Romania. So there was insurrectionist violence in that Ottoman province of Romania, and he had been sent to examine it and to find out what was going on and report back to Yildiz Palace. So obviously, he had a close relationship with the Caliph, as much as you can have a close relationship with somebody you visited maybe 4 or 5 times and they had a correspondence. Quilliam's letters survive in the Ottoman archive. Whether the Caliph wrote any letters to him, we don't know, because that doesn't survive. But certainly, he looked favourably upon him. But he didn't give him that title. He didn't give him that title. But that title was adopted and accepted by Muslims around the world. So in many different pamphlets in different languages, we found Abdullah Quilliam in Urdu, in Arabic, and Farsi being referred to as Sheikh al-Islam of the British Isles in different languages. So the Muslims accepted it, I guess, of the day, particularly the ulama, but not the Ottoman authorities, not officially anyway.
Sister there, also.
Yeah.
You mentioned that he was like a strong advocate for Pan-Islamism, and I just wondered how that support took shape, on the ground within his community. Was it along theological or jurisprudential or cultural or other lines? How did that advocacy kind of take shape on the ground within his community?
It's a good question. In many ways. So if you look at early photographs of the community, you find that inside the mosque they have 2 Ottoman flags hung up inside the mosque at the back. I'll tell you what, if anybody wants to come, I'll do a walkabout afterwards if you want, and I'll show you around the mosque and what it was like. If anybody wants to come, I'll talk you through the different parts of the mosque. But there were 2 flags at the back, which were prominently displayed. They celebrated the Khalid Sultan's birthday. They read the khutbah in his name. Which is a very common historical Islamic practice from the earliest days, and we don't do that now. We don't do that in our mosques now, but this was the historical norm, was to mention the ruler of your territory in your khutbah. This was the normal thing to do. And so as community, the men wore fezzes, the Ottoman fez. And they were Hanafis. When they prayed in namaz, they used the Hanafi. They used Ottoman Turkish terminology, used bayram for Eid and things like that. So that language came into their religious language. As I said, Quilliam had a personal connection with the Ottoman court. Represented the Caliph on a couple of occasions, at least 2 occasions, and he was an important political advocate for the Ottoman cause, and often wrote to national press. He spearheaded campaigns against anti-Ottoman propaganda of the day, often at quite great cost to himself and personal cost. So the Pan-Islamism that he had, it was expressed primarily through his pro-Ottomanism, I would say. But he did sometimes write, he had relations with the Afghan court. His son, Nasrullah Khan, came to the mosque in 1895 and donated £2,500 to the mosque. His father, Abdul Rahman, the Emir of Afghanistan, did recognise him as the leader of the Muslims in Britain. So there's a letter that he sent where he uses that title and he recognises Abdullah Quilliam with the title. We just don't have a similar evidence from the Ottomans that they ever used that title, but the Afghan Emir did. So I think that the other important thing, probably the most important thing, was his newspaper. His newspaper, The Crescent, and the magazine Islamic World went to dozens of countries around the world and connected Muslims together in a kind of pan-Islam network that stretched from British India to South Africa, to Australia, to America, and to different majority Muslim countries. So the newspaper was very, very widely read. Some scholars think that it's as important as some of the other major newspapers of the time that we think about pan-Islamic newspapers of the early 20th century, like Al-Manar. It was more widely distributed than Al-Manar, the famous, very, very famous book, magazine published by Rashid Rida and his teacher, Muhammad Abdul. So it was more widely distributed than that very, very famous journal, Al-Manar, the Lighthouse. So I think we have to think that Quilliam was a great pioneer of a new form of pan-Islamism that used print, used the newspaper, and it used the steamships of the British Empire to get the newspaper all around, all the ports.
So about 32 different countries.
Well, more than that probably. But he used steamships and he used print, the cutting edge technologies of the day. It's like today, or you've got Snapchat Imam, and, you know, or imams who are very not shy to use modern technologies. This is what they use that technology now to get the word about Islam out.
Can I share something on that? One of the British public, a non-Muslim person, gave us a postcard a few years back when we first opened it. And on the postcard it says, "Dear Sheikh Quilliam, I have not received my quarterly crescent." They used to publish a newsletter, quarterly, which would go around the globe, like Brother Yahya said. And in there it says, "I have not received my quarterly crescent, it must have got lost in the post." And it's got a ship mark, postmark, that says 1895, Lahore, India. But we know Lahore is in Pakistan. So when I saw the original postcard, I was really, flabbergasted with it, that my amazing, this must be very true, that the postcard is an original postcard with the shape mark 1895, which says Lahore, India. And the other thing I wanted to share is that from abroad, people would simply write Abdullah Quilliam Mosque, Liverpool, and will arrive here without any postcode. Now, nowadays, if you don't put the postcode, it ends up God knows where. But all you have to say is Abdullah Quilliam Mosque, Liverpool, and it arrives here. So it's amazing how popular he was across the globe. Or the British public knew the first mosque here. Sorry, Sheikh.
So, shall we wrap it up?
Oh, I think one more question from the same sister. Go on. We're getting this one. I've got one.
Okay, this will be the last question.
He's got another one.
Sorry, so like with that Pan-Islamism, was it, I guess, an attempt to unify between, I guess, between their community and Islam across the globe, or is it more a sense of trying to model themselves upon like the Ottoman, I guess, like presentation of Islam? Have I got a complete wrong idea?
I think there was a political solidarity. But I don't think that. I think, as I was mentioning earlier, Quilliam's sort of idea about hybrid practice to call people to Islam. We never learned that from any Ottoman. I mean, to be honest with you, the Ottoman consulate in Liverpool was very critical about all of that. As was another book that I worked on. It came out this year, Islam Victoria in Liverpool. It's a travelogue by Yusuf Sami Ismail. And again, he's very, very critical of these, what he sees as unorthodox practices. Of course, the community defended it as a kind of form of cultural dawah and outreach, but it created a lively debate. If you like, Quilliam was stuck between, and his community was stuck between the passers-by on the West Derby Road who were flinging stones at them, and then all the Orthodox Muslims who had come, heard news of this community from the newspapers and come to find this mosque and to find them singing Islamic lyrics to Christian style hymns. They were like, "Listen, brother, this is not how you pray." And, so he was caught between those two sets of expectations. But as I said, in the beginning of this community's life, I said he was largely self-taught. Maybe over the years he learned more, but he basically taught himself. And he set up the community. So, I think, there'll be some maybe leeway for that, some excuses made for that.
Basically, I'm taking this privilege as the MC to just get the question in. And I had quite a few, but...
just one.
Yeah. Okay. So it was basically, it was almost why do people turn to poetry, and sometimes it's at joyous or difficult periods of their life. And so my question, it's kind of twofold, is firstly, how does his poetry enrich our understanding of him as a man? And secondly, are there times in his life where you feel he turns to poetry as a form of solace or expression?
Yeah, really excellent questions. I mean, I think that Quilliam, my theory is, and I think people are entitled to have their own readings of these poems, but my reading of the poems is that they're at times very autobiographical and very personal. So Quilliam uses the poetry to speak of his, as he says in one of his poems, his inmost part. So he's sort of laying bare his soul. And I think some of the poems, not all of them, but some of the poems are very autobiographical. And we note that in the footnotes. we note where we think, Ron and I think it is biographical, we say that we think it's that. So I think he does turn to his poem sometimes to express what's in his troubling him in his heart. At other times, as I said, he's using poems to teach, as an imam, as a leader of his community. So I think there are different purposes with the poems. But I think at times you're right, he does turn to the poems to express personal feeling, even talk about times of difficulty, in some of the poems. I think also you see his development as well, because the sophistication of the poetry in his later life, that he wrote in his 50s and 60s, is quite apparent compared to the part 2 section in particular of the book. You'll see a real development in his thought and in his understanding of Islam, and it's quite profound, the mystical dimension of his poetry in that later poetry, which is something you don't see in the early poetry. So I think you can see development in him as well.
Can I just say, for the audience purposes, we know he's buried in Woking Cemetery, in Brookwood Cemetery in Woking. Two things. Do we know where he's buried? We know there's no stone head for that. But secondly, what was his relation with Muhammad ibn Pickthall? Who was older, Abdullah Quilliam or Muhammad ibn Pickthall? I know I've been told Muhammad ibn Pickthall was inspired by Abdullah Quilliam, or is it the other way around? And do we know where he's buried at all, for the audience's sake? And for my sake as well.
Pickthall was younger, and by about 20 years.
Right.
And Pickthall, he did know Quilliam, but only Quilliam when he came to London. He didn't know Quilliam in Liverpool. They did work together in a number of different cultural and events, cultural societies and political causes. The pro-Ottoman work, pro-Caliphate work, and cultural and intellectual endeavours. So years later, when Quilliam was an old man and Pickthall was serving up the Nizam of Hyderabad, the Nizam, which was the large independent Muslim state in British India at the time. He established an English language journal, Islamic Culture. Pickthall was the editor, and he commissioned Abdullah Quilliam to write for that journal. So the final section of this book collects together Quilliam's own translations of Arabic Abbasid court poetry, or you can say maybe his inspirations from that poetry. So that's like the final section of the book. In a way, that was a commission from Pickthall. So they did work together. But I don't think Pickthall was inspired by Quilliam. He had his own, he travelled out to the east himself, and seen for himself. His grave is unmarked.
Any reason why?
We don't really know, and it's not really clear why his grave wasn't marked, but it's a mystery because we don't know where the plot number is. We might be able to identify it the other way around, which is like by a process of elimination. So by process of elimination, if you identify everybody else, who's left, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Hanafi school, you can put a headstone within 50 feet of where a person is buried, because at the end of the day, regardless of the reality of that person, if you're going to say a Fatiha or pray for them, the soul will be in the vicinity, so it doesn't matter if it's 50 feet out. As such, if you're going to make du'as for them or something, that distance doesn't matter. So in the Hanafi school, we could put a grave in that whole section. There are spare plots. We could do it that and just put some kind of marker or headstone there. And it would be important because people need to make prayers for him when they visit and pay their respects to Pickthall, Quilliam, Lord Headley, Guy Eaton, Muhammad Abdullah Yusuf Ali, and other great translators of the Quran. Many people are buried there. Sayyid Amir Ali, many people are buried there. So it's a kind of history book of early British Islam in that.
I mean, I have been there in the Woking, the Brookwood Cemetery a few years back, and what we found that again we were told by a historian, and he says there is an empty grave which has no headstone, which is right next to Imam Abdul Pictal. So they think it might be Abdullah Quilliam's gravestone, the grave.
There's a lot of rumours, brother, but...
I'm not claiming anything.
Did you get help? We're not going to start paying cash.
No.
Just ordinary historians.
In the audience, we have a sister Samia who's doing research on Abdullah Quilliam and his family. I've spoken to her on the phone. Is she here? There you go. So Sister Samia is doing research about the Lancaster University on Abdullah Quilliam and the family. Do you have any question you'd like to ask the expert here at all, or anything like that? And thank you for taking the initiative to do a research on such an iconic person as well from our side. Any question for Brother here?
I was thinking about the role of, like he wrote free verse, he wrote using rhyme, meter. So this was thinking about, did he teach himself how to write poetry, or was it just something he grew up with and how the canonical English was being taught at the time?
I mean, I don't really know the answer to that question, but obviously he had a good education. He went to the Liverpool Institute, which was really well regarded, and he was a very able student, and always had a lot of language. Obviously, you train as a lawyer and as a journalist, both, language is your tool, right? Whether it's in the courtroom or whether it's in, writing a piece of journalism. So, I think that he cared a lot about how he expressed himself, and he took a lot of great care over it. So I think that, I don't think he was a poet per se, but he's somebody a man of letters who gave time to poetry, amongst, all the other books. He wrote 3 novels, there are thousands of pages of the Crescent, there are several books he wrote, so he was very, very prolific. So I think poetry was just one of the things that he did, but I don't think we could describe him as a poet. Like, it wouldn't be in the first thing you would say about him, if you know what I mean. So I don't think he's got a very distinctive style, but you're right, he does, especially later on, he starts to play around with the hustle, trying to translate that into English metrical form. So he goes from like a more conventional style of writing to more adventurous, particularly the later poetry. In part 2, you can see there's a very radically different meters, and he's really experimenting at that point. Whereas before he was quite, the early poetry, the one that the meaning of Surah Al-Fatiha that we read at the beginning, that's very much more in a conventional kind of mid-19th, 20th century to mid-19th century kind of, romantic poetry of Browning and people like that. So it's very much in that vein. So I think it's a good point.
Praise be to God, the Lord of all. Praise Him, all creatures, great and small. With raptures now the mercies sing of Him the day of judgment's King. Exclaim, O Lord, we worship Thee. Now while we kneel on bended knee, oh, grant us by Thy mighty power needful assistance every hour. Direct us, Lord, in the right way, nor ever let us go astray. Preserve us from thy holy wrath. And when the sands of life have run, and all our time on earth be done, we pray thee, O thou God of love, take us to thee in heaven above. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Muhammad Rasulullah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Muhammad Rasulullah.
Hey, Assalamu alaikum. I just want to say thank you for that beautiful opportunity to sing Abdullah Quilliam's Anglo-Saxon Islamic Christian syncretism, which essentially, he combined, it was a combination of the different worlds or the different forms of belief or practice. And the subject matter was the opening chapter of the Quran, the 7 verses of Al-Fatiha, which means the opening. And what Abdullah Quilliam did, he rewrote this in a long meter hymn that was actually sung in congregation accompanied by an organist. So there is a lot more to be explored about this great Englishman who became a Muslim and then navigated his way by embracing the new religion that he embraced together with his existing English culture. That was what was remarkable about the man, to find a equilibrium for him to then spread Islam in his community and leave a profound and remarkable legacy worth knowing about. So once again, thank you very much for the opportunity. We hope to explore more sounds of his writing and hopefully share that with you. My name is Hassan Rasul. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.